Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Acid Horizon. This is Craig, and ordinarily in my introductions, I typically ask that you support our Patreon account or join our reading groups or support Acid Horizon by going to the merch store. But today, what I would like you to do is take a look at the link at the top of the show notes. It's going to take you to a blog post that I have written. And if you haven't read it already, it's going to inform you of some critical actions and struggles that Acid Horizon itself has been undergoing. So go ahead and take a look at that. Today on the show, we have Vex Tape. Vex Ashley, who's come to talk to us about the intersection of the work of Georges Bataille and her work as a pornographer. Also in the discussion is our friend and collaborator, Noah Trapolino, who worked with us on the Acephalus project, the erotic tarot of Georges Bataille, which is in production now. And we want to say thanks again for supporting that. Also, just a quick note right at the top of this episode, you are about to hear a discussion with explicit mentions of pornography and sex, and you might want to be wary of whose ears it might land upon. Maybe not the best episode to play out loud while you're working at the call center or the cafe. Or maybe it is. Props to you if that's the case. Anyway, here's the episode.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory podcast. Today we are talking about work of Georges Bataille and others through a kind of eroticism in both theory and practice. And today for this, I am joined, of course, by our resident pornographer, Noah, of course, collaborator on our upcoming Acephalus, the erotic tarot of Georges Bataille, and special guest, Vex Ashley from Four Chambers, aka Four Chambered Heart, who does erotic artwork, does pornographic filmmaking, and she's here today talk to us about how the various kinds of erotic theories have had an impact on her work and what it means to make erotic and pornographic art today in the increasingly censorious and in many ways fascizing on fascist kinds of cultural scenes. Vex, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So just to sort of start off, I mean, could you give us a bit of an introduction to your work and your approach to the making of erotic art and pornographic filmmaking? Even if there is even a hard distinction, I know the distinction between erotica and pornography can be somewhat classed in many ways. And just how generally you get into this sort of artistic sphere.
Yeah, so I have been making porn for the last 10 plus years with my project called Four Chambers. And generally, I kind of say that we are a creative, conceptual pornography house, and we kind of have a focus on collaborative DIY practices and making work that is deeply kind of sensual and conceptual and uses porn as maybe something more like a medium for ideas rather than just necessarily a functional product.
Yeah, and in terms of how these ideas sort of come to help you sort of bring this artwork into being, what sort of stuff are you usually drawing upon? I know we mentioned Bataille at first, but I know your work also has references to things like, for example, Donna Haraway. There's a movie called A Cyborg Manifesto, and as well stuff like I just had his name in my head. I'm going to say David Cronenberg because of Crash, but Ballard. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah. So, like, basically, my history, I started off as an art school, and I always kind of say that my grounding in creative work is like art school bullshit. Like, I think my favorite thing about making creative work was always kind of the reference finding, the kind of the way of being a magpie, where you're pulling all of these different things and making connections between disparate theories and almost creating new language from those bits. And so even when I was just kind of starting out, I think I was at art school when we started to experiment with porn making. And for me, I was kind of interested to see if I could put the same consideration for aesthetics and kind of concepts as I was already doing in my art practice into work with sex. So for me, the same way that I kind of think artistically is the same way that I make pornographic work. I think when I started out, I was, there's this kind of an idea that basically, the kind of porn that I'm making, that's different to other porn. So that means that it's obviously better. And, it's not like that bad porn. And then, very quickly that concept is kind of challenged. And I think I really shied away from thinking about porn as art because it felt like it was trying too hard to sanitize something. It was trying to kind of bring it into the realm of acceptability as opposed to maybe something that, that dichotomy between art and porn was kind of bullshit. But I really feel like recently maybe I've come back around in a different way, and that I, over the last 10 years, I've been reflecting on what it has meant to make work with my body. And really, like, my porn making has been my art practice for the last 10 years. So I kind of try and hold it in a duality of being like, it's not art and it is art at the same time. And it's definitely been art for me.
In terms of, I mean, Noah, do you find this is a similar reflection to how you do end up doing politics? Obviously, you not make it with your body, you make it with other people's bodies. Although I think you've done a few occasional self work.
For sure. I think that is an anxiety. I think maybe my anxiety, it might be similar, but a little different in that there's a question of my gaze and how can I avoid doing, male gaze activities constantly. But I quickly get over that. And I think, what I'm anxious about when making art is, I think, has a different level of what's at stake, because like you said, your body is very involved. It's your community that you're bringing in immediately, and this collaborative nature. And while I'm sort of restricted to maybe a more base symbolism element with my just 2D art, but I think that I've found it so interesting, and people have responded so much to it on the internet. It might be being banned on Instagram constantly, etc. It still grows because people are, I think, yearning for a sort of intimacy and sensuality and eroticism that you totally lose because it's either this insane pornography or Puritanism, and at least for many people. And so I think there's finding this middle path, which maybe is where the word erotic comes into play. This sort of more sensual, different type of intimacy, more thoughtful, less utilitarian, perhaps less Sadian type of pornography. And that's what I get from your work, and I think that's what your community enjoys so much. But I mean, I love that you're also not sure about this distinction between art and porn. I get, there's this, we're in an interesting climate, and Adam, you mentioned this in the pre-show, but I don't know where porn is landing, I guess, in the home, on the phone, and in a moment where, we're seeing these returns for the family, calls for tradition, like how do you feel into this political climate today about this?
I mean, it sucks. It is interesting because, I've been doing this for 10 years now. So I have almost this huge window barometer to kind of work from as to how it felt like when I started and how it feels now. And it is difficult because, in many ways, there have been huge successes in terms of kind of acceptability of sex work as work, and pornographic work is way more prolific in the public consciousness, and it's more visible. But there is a part of me that questions whether that visibility is ostensibly a good thing or a bad thing, because as many other kind of marginalized communities know, is that sometimes when the eye of Sauron is turned on you, it essentially leaves you open to way more restriction, way more censorship. And that's essentially what's happened, is the kind of ubiquity of porn tube sites and free porn basically opening up even just people who want to share work about sex, it doesn't necessarily have to be from a commercial point of view. It's made those people way, way, way more vulnerable. When I was starting out, it was like there were so many spaces to share work about sex. I'm a Tumblr girl. So much of my education, both about art, about sex, about, philosophy, like theoretical concepts, all of that stuff really came from being immersed in a community of people who were able to kind of share freely in a space that didn't feel like it was completely open and safe for everyone. It felt like a community that was built on people sharing interests within a kind of sealed world. And that's not how the internet feels anymore, because really, in order to kind of sell people the most stuff, what you need is this kind of normative baseline. You need something that is safe, acceptable for every person, regardless of age, regardless of culture, regardless of, perspective, what you're bringing to it. And what that's done is just really pulled the rug out from, I don't know, for me, the internet just used to feel like a place of freedom. And maybe it's because I'm now, I'm old now, but it's not how, it doesn't feel like that anymore. It doesn't feel like it has that real sense of like possibility and community building. It really feels like the focus is corporations.
No, absolutely. As you're saying, all these sort of free porn sites, and it does turn it into a platform. And the problem with platforms is that everyone talks about platforms like the internet as an echo chamber. The problem is it's not, because anyone can walk into any conversation. I mean, this is the thing with Twitter now. Any Nazi can walk into any conversation that's happening in a certain locale of Twitter, if it's like between any minority community, and then walk in and say, oh, look, they're all planning to do this. Whereas these conversations would typically happen in, forums, or even, just for example, gay bars that fascists such wouldn't walk into.
It really reminds me actually of when Tumblr shut down our safer work content. Somebody who I used to follow on Tumblr was a sex worker who their name was Grimy, and their content was grimy. It was deliberately kind of meant to be within that area. And this post of them when they move over to Twitter of them licking an airplane toilet seat absolutely blew up within like the right wing kind of Christian community. It became, and it's this idea that like when you move it out of a space where it's people who get it or people who are curious about it into a space where it's almost on display for the public, it really changes the way that stuff is viewed and the safety of the people involved, I guess.
No, absolutely. And it also seems as well with platform infrastructure to increasingly subordinate it to advertising. I mean, Instagram Reels and for example, and short form content on Twitter, because you have to capture things so quickly within such a short time of the average human attention span, which is meant to be constantly, scrolling. I mean, how do you think that presents a challenge to the production of, not only erotic art, but eroticism itself in sort of this age of quite instant advertiser-like gratification?
Which I would add, I think one of the important tenets of eroticism is suspense, slowness, right? It is a different play with time. And one of your works are a tease in a way, because you don't give the easiest thing to be satisfied to, if you will, off the bat, which is what a lot of porn and those long compilations are for, is that TikTok mentality. So yeah, just how does that change your approach?
Yeah, I definitely, for me, I completely agree. For me, I think what we were interested in with Four Chambers was trying to make films that felt like fucking, not just looked like fucking. So there's something of the idea of it being embodied, having that sensation of pulling the pull towards something, the desire to move towards something rather than getting everything up front. So we were really keen that it was. And this isn't even something necessarily that was a conscious choice. It's just maybe the way that I felt like the films worked was this idea of rejecting an instant gratification, which I think for me was maybe where some of the kind of more, I guess, like traditional or more widely available porn kind of stuff maybe fell a bit short, because you do just get everything at once. The lighting is incredibly flat. It's like you can see everything. It moves very quickly to the crescendo of the action, and then it just stays there and tries to hold you there for as long as possible. And I think that what we do tends to lean more towards giving you something that kind of grips you, and then allowing your own imagination as the viewer to go in kind of curious and take what you can out of some, which is why I really love using things like symbolism. I love using things that obscure rather than necessarily reveal, because that pull that you're talking about, that kind of the gap between knowing and not knowing is for me the point where we're finding that the real eroticism of desire. Actually, when you have something, for me, that it's like, well, why do I give a shit? For me, it's more interesting to kind of play with the dynamic of the push and pull.
Right. I think this might tie back into Bataille, if we will, to honor the episode and what we had reached out to you to read about, which for Bataille, eroticism is a privileged form of excess, as our friend Stuart Kendall has put it. And Bataille likes to deal with excess in a lot of ways. Eroticism is what is not necessarily about reproducing. It is the abundance there. And there's also this interesting tie into why do some of the strongest, for me, erotic artworks, are they simply line drawings? Something very scarce that still reveals this abundance. And that's kind of, I think, what you're saying, where you're when you take a lot out of frame, when you take a lot away, that instead of putting it on a silver platter, you actually get this this abundance, if you will, of desire because you don't have it all. And that's something I like to think about with my art as I'm moving to painting bigger things. Like, oh, wow, I'm doing a lot. I'm putting a lot on here, a lot on the plate. And we were talking about right before you got on, in the Bible, there's a lot of erotic moments that don't reveal themselves until you get a couple layers in. There's the older story of the very fat king Eglon being killed by this prophet Ehud, and he loses his dagger and his fat stomach, and the word for stomach is womb, and the dagger was brought in his thigh, like strapped to his thigh. So there's all these moments where you have to like relook at things in the Bible. I'm wondering, with that tangent aside, how does Bataille in literature, like, how do you like to think about symbolism and make it playful and things of that nature? And also, I guess, any thoughts on the Bataille reading we did for the Eroticism? I know you've talked about him in the past a lot before.
My relationship to Bataille specifically is like, I was one of those kind of kids where I would go to the bookshop and I would like go to the erotic art section and just like in Waterstones and just like look through. So I was like reading Sard and Bataille, but just kind of like, just to sort of like, I think I was just looking for the thing that was the most extreme. And so I read The Story of the Eye when I was probably like 18, 19. And I thought it was really interesting, but it's so interesting to come back to it now and see the things that I missed or see the ways that it hits different. I think for me, the thing that really resonates with Bataille's writing is the pursuit of God, but like the pursuit of God not through the cerebral, but through the visceral, through the body, through the guts, through like the way, through doing rather than thinking. And it feels, and I think maybe God was something that wasn't really necessarily on my radar as like an 18-year-old, or I rejected that kind of, I rejected the pursuit of that as something that was worthy. But honestly, I feel like now so much of it feels like Bataille's writing feels very romantic and it feels very spiritual. And it is so interesting when you make porn. I think there's the sensation of fucking feels like, for me, it's always been about a pursuit of transcendence, about a pursuit of kind of coming outside of yourself, the excess that you're speaking about, like trying to achieve that excess. And honestly, for me, like, I think it's something that is almost an eternal pursuit. Like, I don't think there's an end point. I don't think there's like a point that we can reach where we're done with that. I don't see any value in the idea that like we will become enlightened at this point, like this is the amount of excess that you need in order to reach God. But it's that I guess that maybe the desire, the push and pull that we were talking about before, where it's like it's almost like that's the holy grail, and we have to it's the search for that which brings us closer, but I don't necessarily think we will ever reach it. And I think for me, like his use of symbolism, of like surrealism, of things not being just the thing that they are, but also standing in for many other things. That's how I like to think about, when I'm making films. I always take the piss out of myself because it's always like you're watching a Four Chambers film and you're jerking off and you're like, I'm really trying to come. But then it's like it cuts to like a snail, or like if anyone can actually come during the film, I'm like, congratulations, like you truly have achieved transcendence. It's not necessarily, it's not the easiest feat. But it's really important to me because for me, like sex feels like that. Sex isn't just about sex. Like sex is in everything, and the way in which it kind of has like tendrils in other parts of life, like is often for me more erotic necessarily than just thinking about it in like its base functionality.
But just in terms of just thinking about Bataille's theory of God, I always love it as well because it doesn't require God to exist, because he's like the void of God's non-existence has exactly the same anthropological function. And I want to actually pick up this idea of the void, because I know one of your films is called, it's in the French, L'appel du vide, like the call of the void. And sorry, my French pronunciation is atrocious. But how does the void come into it? Just like in terms of the idea of, especially for Bataille being so focused to the idea that having taboos makes us human, and then encountering that through his literary works, which I really love. I mean, he's very bad at writing women characters most of the time. I've noticed like they're always in the subject position sometimes, and like he's always the object, he's always the sun. It's just the anus is always kind of detached. But I do think like a text like My Mother is actually surprisingly good for that, but mostly because there's more masochism in that one. But just Bataille ran over. But in terms of like this idea of the void and taboo, how does this end up fitting into the kinds of topics you approach and eroticize in that way? Particularly, I know as well you do also work around sort of the dominance of the mummy kink, which has sort of disappeared in kind of a post-Freudian wave of shame to the standard like reading of everything as being, you know, daddy issues as being a standard issue, a piece of equipment for most people.
Yeah, the void is very important to my work. It's so interesting because sometimes the influence of Bataille, I think, permeates a lot of, or maybe we're just kind of very much in, you know, that we're I feel like it works in tandem, because for me the void is the unknown, is the thing that we fear, is nothingness, is emptiness, is like possibility, is like infinity. And the void is also like, the void is a hole, the void is a mouth, the void is a cunt, the void is an asshole. And it's about like, and the act of like filling that void is the act that like Bataille's talking about, where, for me anyway, like Bataille's talking about where essentially it's like you you'll find God in the void, like you find God in the undoing, as opposed to in like thinking, like being incredibly put together and proper and cerebral. Like you the way you access that pursuit of transcendence is through essentially kind of blowing yourself to pieces. And The Call of the Void, the film L'Appel de Vide, it's okay, my French pronunciation is also probably really shit. That's actually like one of the most kind of, it was really one of our most personal films, in that it is the only film that I've actually not been, I was a performer, but I wasn't involved in the editing of the film at all. It was Four Chambers, is mostly me and my partner. And it was him sort of making a film about what it feels like to like watch me fuck somebody else. And so it acts as like this kind of like a poem or a love letter, both to like me, but also to the experience of that like kind of complete undoing. And that it was like one of our most personal films. And the whole idea of The Call of the Void, like the idea that there's basically the reason why watching someone you love get fucked by somebody else is like completely devastating, but also you're drawn to it, is because essentially you're drawn to like the thing that terrifies you the most. You're drawn to the thing that you fear, or the most horrible thing, or the thing that feels devastating. You kind of can't look away. I guess like we're thinking about Ballard with like car crashes, the like rubbernecking, like the idea that like people are obsessed with like looking at devastation, and it's like, you know, it's going to hurt you, but there's something in you that wants to that wants to explore that wants to see that. And yeah, that turned into a whole series. So we have another film called Fucked and then Cucked as well after that, which are all, and another film called L'Enfer, which is sort of similarly about like jealousy. So like, I think for me, I just got to the point where I was like, I don't want to make nice porn anymore. I want to make porn about the ways in which people feel horrible about sex. I'm like, what's the point? It's like, there's enough porn where everyone feels good. For me, I'm like, where the thing that's interesting is like where does it feel good and where does it feel bad, and what's the discourse between those two things?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder, for me, I think one of the great things about your team and your project and the work you do is it sort of forces people to reinvestigate what porn is, right, on a very base level. And I think that the pornography has a role to play in the world of incels, in the world of, I don't know, I think it has a role to play in the world of conservatism too, and what is the super taboo that you are not telling everyone that you're watching, right? Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your thoughts of how do you what do you think about the incel phenomenon, not just as like a big blanket thing, but how does do you think Four Chambers has a role to play in that, and like how fixing that, like is there we said theory and practice, like the praxis of doing good porn, is there anything, can we art away our problems with that?
Ooh, I don't know whether we can art away our problems. I definitely think that potentially what creative work for me does is essentially opens doors. Like it just opens doors of possibility. And it's about whether somebody chooses to walk through that and what they're bringing through that door. So I think it can like, give with one hand and it can really take away with another hand. I feel like incel culture for me is a kind of output of the input that we are living in that the input that we're living in is a world where we're like increasingly isolated. Everyone is increasingly isolated. And we are kind of glued to our screens. We are, less and less in community with each other. We're seeing ourselves more and more as hyper individual people whose worth is based not on the community that we build or the art that we make, but is about financial or social success based on like a metric system of judgment. And all of these things kind of contribute to this like real sense of isolation. And I think porn does too, in the sense that, people, I think it's entirely normal to like look at something that it's like made as an aspirational product, to look at it and go like, well, that's not what my sex feels like. Well, that's not the sex that I'm having. And that's not the sex that it ever feels like it's potentially possible for me to have. And that's frustrating. I feel like we all experience that in various other arenas. It's not just exclusive to porn. So, but for me, what it is, when people talk about like the harms of porn, versus like the good of porn, and people are expecting there to be this kind of, if we put it on the scales and we weigh it up, like we'll find whether porn is good or bad. And for me, like that's actually maybe not interesting. I think it's more like porn is just an expression of human experience, and the human experience is infinitely complicated, is mired in all of this other stuff to do with sex that we're bringing into it, and that actually trying to come up with a moral absolute on what it does, or whether it's a benefit or a negative to society, is kind of useless. It's such a wide church. Like there is no one porn. There's like this huge canon of a variety of different things that are just kind of lumped under the idea of pornography. And so I kind of think it's better to kind of think about it in the ways in which it is a mirror to our experience, as opposed to the thing that is guiding it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think absolutely, particularly as a frontier in a way for like new kinds of like policing and economic sort of destitution. I think pornography, particularly sex workers, end up being the frontier of a lot of that. I mean, do you think that pornography is particularly a kind of frontier of this? Because I'm thinking particularly in terms of like, there's that book by Sam Delaney, like Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, about how Times Square used to be mostly porno theaters, and in a way, sort of the collective consumption has moved from sort of the theater aspect more to the private aspect, in the same way as public space is being lost, and we're consuming it in a more individualized way as individuals online. Platforms always individualize us, like structurally, and indeed in terms about the fight against platforms. I mean, that's kind of where sex workers have had to be like the first port of call in a way, because when the OnlyFans creators had to fight against their own platforms for being, for listeners, if you don't know this, like there was an attempt to essentially debank them. That's the fight that's still ongoing, but it's a fight at which you're going to fight against like Elon Musk. There's a good model here, folks. There is like actual organized sort of content creators kind of political consciousness there. So do you think the porn ends up being a kind of frontier, as you said, a kind of mirror to society in that way, and sort of a frontier for various kinds of labor as well as cultural struggles?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of the kind of technological advance of the internet has come because people want to see people fucking, like, so, and they want to see people fucking in new and exciting ways, and they want to be able to get close to that as close to that as possible. So, I spent a lot of my life as a cam girl, and like camming was the Twitch, the original Twitch streamers. Like cam girls were the inventors of streaming culture. And, it's so interesting because the most successful shows for me were never necessarily just about sex. They were always kind of about that weird sense of connection, or it was a bit like being a children's TV presenter, essentially. So I think often sex is the doorway to progression, but what happens is that means that they're also the first people to experience the sharp end of some of this legislation, because like sex is just so powerful, like its potential to make people feel scared, to feel unseated, to feel under control, like out of their own control. That like sex is so good at that it is still such an object of fear for powerful people, because it's potential to kind of like sex and sex work is really the biggest transfer that of wealth from like men to people who are not men, basically, and like powerful men to people who are not men, in terms of and that is scary, because just doesn't matter how powerful you are, for the most part people still feel at the mercy of their horniness. And we see that because, we see like the clients of sex workers, and we see, the senators like dick pics. It's so powerful that people are so keen to initially kind of try and make it go away. But now I think the way, what you were talking about with the rise of fascism, it feels like now what people are interested in is almost this idea of rejecting it from the point of view of it being unhealthy, or that actually there's a full rejection of sex. We're seeing these men like their ideal is to be like these sculpted kind of Marvel hero looking bodies with like incredibly high testosterone. But what they're not using is these like sculpted bodies and this high testosterone. They're not using it to fuck. They're using it to be better than other men. And actually, there's this idea, especially online, that, the idea that like being celibate or rejecting porn and rejecting sex, rejecting the sensual in favor of like, I guess, like the sterile, the more you can kind of sterilize and sanitize and control your life, that is now the ideal. That's the ideal of success, I think.
Right. I mean, it's the sexless aesthetics of being hot as so like vapid and void of a soul, I think, as very fascinating. To maybe bring in like entertain some of our psychoanalysis friends of the Freudian nature with if we thinking of pornography and this world as a mirror, you are and your community are very attuned to what kinks and fetishes are happening at various moments. And in the previous interviews recently, you've been kind of popping around. I know, like the figure of the mother has come, the mommy is back. What is up with that? You talk about it at length elsewhere, and we'll link to those interviews, I think, in the show notes. But yeah, maybe tease us with why that is a thing.
If I could add something to that, actually, because one of the things I found really interesting, you mentioned being, so like inner psychoanalyst, Mintley Johnson, you said it's like being a children's TV presenter, but it is, because like to the extent what it seems like is that what you're sort of having to do, and if I get this wrong completely, to tell me I'm wrong, in terms of you're essentially curating vulnerability. In a way, you're sort of creating vulnerability in a way that makes it pleasurable from someone on the other side. And it seems like the fascist response to this would be, no, I'm not vulnerable. You by curating my vulnerability, you have actually given me the vulnerability. It's someone else who has made me this way. And that seems like an interesting way of passing that response. And even maybe why fascists have a very public, kink these days with the crad wife, which is basically a kink for conservatives. But sorry, I'll leave that there.
No, yeah, I think the mommy for me was something that it's something that's personal to me. Like it's something that's like deeply, deeply powerful in my own sexual psyche. And basically during lockdown, me and my very good friend, Valerie, we both share this fetish. Like we're really, we were like, why do we like to be called mommy? We love having these really kind of like existential conversations about like, why do we fuck the way we fuck? And thinking about like what it is about the mother archetype, which feels like really taboo, but kind of very gratifying in our lives. And, we're both like women in our 30s. And we were having this kind of discourse between the fact that we're at the stage of our life where we're kind of maybe choosing that, whether we will or we won't become a mother. And the fact that we're not mothers, how does it feel to kind of eroticize the archetype of the mother? How does it feel to access some of the societal benefits that like you get from motherhood, this idea of being put on a pedestal, being worshipped, being the pinnacle of womanhood, the pinnacle of goodness, pure, the ultimate purity. And especially for two people who work with sex, there's something incredibly transgressive about, essentially being like a publicly slutty person and essentially taking the mother archetype by force and embodying that and fucking with that and playing around in the mess of that. Like, what does that mean? Because honestly, we had this, like I said, I was on Tumblr for a long time. We had the rise of the daddy dom, the like call your boyfriend daddy was such a huge phenomenon. And we were like, my friend who I made the film with, she went to a convention, I think a dominatrix convention. And, she tells this story about how they had to write their name and their kind of, I guess, like dom alignment on their card. And she wrote mommy. And somebody came up to her and essentially said like, oh, you actually can't put that because that might be very, it might be really triggering for some people. And that's so interesting because, people out there could have daddies. So we were like, why is it so powerful? Like, what is it about the idea of the mother that, completely unseats us? And, despite when we're making the film, we had so many revelations about what that meant. And in many ways, you realize that despite the fact that like maybe daddy is, there's this almost cultural acceptance that dads can be shit. Like, that's fine. That's almost written into culture. Like, dads are absent, dads are emotionally neglectful, dads leave. But the idea of being left, neglected, or rejected by your mother is so much, potentially maybe that's so much more potent because, the mother is meant to be this person who is a wellspring of infinite love and infinite care. So to like the bad mother, the evil mother, like she's the lowest of the low in society. And, if we're talking about like, my mother, it's like the Bataille text, it's like the mother who's also a whore, like the mother who fucks, like the mother who is sexually like licentious and open, that has the possibility, the potential to like send you mad, which is why the insult like motherfucker is so powerful because it's there's something, and it's such an old insult, like it's obviously been part of our cultural consciousness for so long.
The mother versus the father is this wonderful archetype that just comes out in everything, right? A lot of the Bible, the Old Testament, is an anxiety of, do you descend from your mom or do you descend from your dad? Is it matrilineal? Is it patrilineal? Masak, Leopold von Masak of masochism fame, fetishizes the mother a lot. And he's writing on Jewish folklore and eroticizing those. And the figure of Mother Nature as cold and cruel, on Deleuze's terms, is a reoccurring theme. And so there's also constantly in the art world, like in the New York scene, there are some artists who focus on the mother historically. I think of Colleen Barry, who does a lot of larger figurative works, Jenny Saville, people like that. And it's always very potent. I agree. And there's a lot at stake with the mother. And so I love that, the possibility of the bad mother is much more terrifying than the possibility of the bad father. There's a lot to be said there, but yeah, Adam, go for it.
Well, no, it just reminds me of a lot. I mean, I was recently reading some Elaine Sessou for sort of to try to give anything to complement or fix the parts of Bataille, I think, that just fundamentally don't work. He does actually talk a little bit about sort of the desire to be a mother itself as being something kind of taboo, to have sort of the appearances of motherliness. And I thought that would be really interesting to tie into a little bit, particularly the Maman movies, because they also involve in a way seizing upon an aesthetic and equally a literal, to go full Deleuze-Guattari, a bit of desiring production there because of the biohacking involved in producing lactation. I wonder if you wanted to talk about that sort of in terms of sort of, it was the biohacking is a way part of a statement about sort of in a way that one can appropriate aspects of motherhood for that aesthetic domain or that libidinal or pleasurable domain. Because in a way, it is a real site of political contestation. I mean, to say nothing of Mumsnet, which is essentially it's like, well, if anyone knows anything about the transphobic movement over there, they kind of want to reinforce that as kind of a walled garden of social reproduction. But that aside, or at least maybe alongside, let's unpack the way in which you can seize the means of production in that literal sense.
I've never thought about it in that context, and I'm absolutely going to text my friend about that because she'll be very happy for that to be used in that way. Yeah, basically, like when we were making this film, one of the things that we started doing in lockdown is we spent a lot of time on Reddit. We spent a lot of time on like the adult breastfeeding forums and realized that basically, you know, anybody, regardless of gender, with the right combination of hormones and stimulation can lactate. Like we all have, you know, for the most part, the mechanics in there. It's just about activating them. And there are things that you can do. There are protocols and routines you can follow that induce lactation. And, you know, this is used in very wholesome ways, you know, for adoptive parents. And it's also used a lot in, you know, very, I guess, you know, I wouldn't necessarily refer to it as depraved, but let's call it depraved ways as the opposite of wholesome, in that like people who want to erotically breastfeed somebody can, you know, you can get yourself to the point where you can make milk. And yeah, honestly, the kind of power in it was so unexpected. It was both completely disgusting to me the first time it happened, despite the fact that I think it's so hot. You know, it happened the first time that I actually produced milk was so kind of such a moment of body horror for me that was so interesting, despite the fact that it's something that I fetishize. And the whole process of it, you know, it felt very powerful to kind of be able to have an experience that feels like it is maybe reserved for only a particular type of woman. And, you know, the good woman is the mother, like the what you're talking about, maybe with the trad wife. And to kind of say, you know, I can approach that on my own terms. I can take that and I can fuck with it and I can use it for my own ends. Another really interesting thing about the production of milk was it really kicked off a whole conversation for all of us in the making of the film, in the ways in which that actually, despite the fact that we think, like you said, that mother, the dichotomy, you know, the distinction between mother and father is so specific, that actually having somebody breastfeed from your breast is a lot more like actually having your dick sucked than. So there's almost this kind of idea of that it actually transcends gender. It's all about kind of power and stimulation and what's the penetrated and what's the penetrating and the kind of give and take. So it really kind of expanded our understanding of our fetish and yeah, maybe to kind of bring it back, the idea of like that mommy isn't actually the domain of women. I don't think mommy to me is a like an exploration of a way of being and a way of presenting in the world. And you know that gender fuckiness really came from like working with an amazing trans woman who was talking about the ways in which her penis like became her surrogate breast for her. Like while she was waiting for her breast to come in, she was sort of like using her penis as a surrogate breast. So we, you know, all of this stuff kind of like it's nebulous.
Right. Yeah. I think, and I just want a follow up there briefly is that, you know, part of one of our favorite philosophers we like to talk about here, Deleuze and Guattari, when they write their book Anti-Oedipus, what they're responding to in a large way is that Freud and the movement of psychoanalysis love to slot people into you're either mommy, daddy, or the son, right? And there's something very anxious about the fact that things can be undecidable or contingent. And, you know, that's their whole idea of becoming woman, becoming animal, in this case, becoming mother as a site of politics. I think is rather profound, being able to approach, as you said, the mother, being a mother on your own terms. And that's why the right has to fight over what sex and gender are, because so much of its history and its power comes from having stability in gender roles. So I think there's a lot to be taken out of why people are so anxious about the mother, is that it is the site of stability for many. As you said, it is more terrifying when the mother runs away, and that's because it's supposed to be the rock, Mother Nature, right? So I think all that's very profound and a wonderful way to explore it in art. I think that's fantastic. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's a bedrock of unpaid labor in many ways. Sort of historically, it's essentially a kind of punishment in terms of the reproductive labor of having children. And in a way, what you end up kind of doing by biohacking your way into producing milk is ultimately saying, see, I got the aesthetic, I got the libidinal aspect here, but I haven't essentially sold my literal labor to to a sort of a patriarchal institution. And that really, I mean, especially in places like England, getting something without paying a hefty price for no reason makes people fucking incredibly mad. And it's always also just, well, another just a side thing. If people want to look into this idea of like recoding parts of your body, we did an episode years ago with Georges Gleason, who's coming back on in a couple of weeks, actually, for her book on history of intersex politics. And we go into like the recoding of like leather daddy culture, recoding the fist as a phallus, recoding the very phenomenon that we know today as bussy as a concept. You know, it is an aspect of play here. And I think that play is also, I mean, do you think that the Mummy King also, there's a danger to it in the same way that, not to be too dialectical here, do exactly what Noah said that Deleuze and Guattari are criticizing, is that it also kind of makes it attributes kind of like a childlike position to the other participants in a way. You know, I mean, is it possible for there to be two? I mean, I guess this is the sort of demonstration. Does Mum in a way sort of demonstrate you can have a simultaneous two mummies without that sort of dialectical contrary of the child?
Yeah, I think it was important for us. Like, we wanted to have two mummies, basically because we wanted to make this film together, but also because we wanted to almost make it so ridiculous. Like the idea that it's like the idea that we're taking on this figure, but it's so ridiculous because there's two of us and we're making this guy call us mommy, and we're like mommy squared. That's how we refer to it. But the idea of the child, like becoming the child or becoming like a childlike figure during sex, is so powerful. And I think it's something that is such a huge kind of thread that runs through our sexual psyche that we're so afraid to talk about, for obvious reasons. And that actually this idea of, for me, the reason why mommy play is so powerful is because what you're doing is you're breaking somebody down. The way that I do it anyway, obviously this is, other people have different ways, but for me, this idea of breaking somebody down, not necessarily through fear or through pain, but through the complete sublimation of the self, through care, through like wrapping somebody up and making them feel so kind of like safe and contained that they're almost reduced to this kind of like pathetic open mouth, like they're just a sight of need. They're just what they want in that moment. It allows you to kind of like slough off all of the ways in which you see yourself as like complex, and your needs become very immediate, like a baby. And you're essentially kind of, you're having power over somebody by like kind of by caring for them, by like telling them that they're perfect, by making every want and every desire good and okay, and kind of allowing them to like draw out of themselves and like relax into this completely infantile state is a really interesting way of doing domination for me, a really interesting and a really powerful way, because it's so psychological and kind of requires so much vulnerability from the other person, really, like to do it really well. And it was really funny because I think I went into this being like, I'm really into mommy stuff. I'm not into adult babies. Adult babies is too far for me. And then getting into all of the kind of theory of, I was like, no, the adult baby is really where it's at. Like, I'm just fucking around on the edges. But they're the people who are really prepared to go deep with it. So really hats off to the adult baby community. I did you dirty.
Yeah, I think, that's, we've had a lot of discussions on, I mentioned Masoch and masochism earlier, and the trick of masochism in a way of having the Dami Mommy is this, Masoch is so obsessed with this person, and Venus infers that he convinces her to enter into a contractual agreement where, yes, she owns him, but suddenly he has all of her time and attention. And so there's this wonderful play of submission and then possession through submitting, and like, how else do you get how else do you get the mother to give you attention through I don't know, some sort of contractual agreement, some arrangement, a mise en scène of fantasy, if you will. I think it's very interesting. Yeah, Adam, any more thoughts on the mother king?
Well, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry, everyone. I've just got the idea in my head now of domunism or momunism. Because there's kind of like a reconfiguring of power there that might not be as like violatory. I don't know, as not just necessarily saying pure matriarchy, because or in a way sort of. I mean, can you say that there's like a detaching of mumminess or mummitude, maybe mummery? No, mummery's something different. Sorry, I'm becoming very English all of a sudden. Detaching all of this from the idea of essentially social reproduction, and in terms of that, detaching it from that. I mean, basically go into full Federici on this. Well, actually, not the full Federici. Her later stuff can be a bit. But in terms of like staying with the mum, I mean, they're thinking about Bataille's book, My Mother, which is interesting because there's no actual incest in that book. It's like a sexual corruption thing. But that's the only book that has masochism in it. And it's weird because Bataille spends so long with Marquis de Sade that Masoch goes up nowhere. But it's the thing that really fixes up his problems, because when we make that contract, as Deleuze talks about, we make ourselves subjects, and it feels like a little bit in sort of the fascist father figure, which also it could be a fascist mother figure, but I think it's more in that sort of the motherhood as punishments, thinking about the kinds of like Margaret Atwood, sort of Gilead's. I mean, does this all feed into a kind of general fear of sexuality, especially in an age where, especially, for example, if you're in the States, in a lot of states within the States, if you use a period tracker app, it's tracking you for the police. And motherhood becomes, as it's infrastructurally designed to be, an actual punishment, an actual, incredibly risky one for one's life. So, in a way, do we need to sort of, is eroticism in a way fighting against, or at least is it an aesthetic vector to try and think about sexuality in a way that's uncoupled from its domination? Because otherwise, are we just left with the fact that sort of a very sort of, in a way, Roman view of sex as inherently dominational? I mean, that's when me and Noah were talking about this in the pre-show, when the biblical sort of doesn't really have an idea of homosexuality. Homosexuality was invented by a Hungarian gay journalist in 1868, and it was then picked up by a bunch of German guys. And the Romans just had penetratee and penetrated, and one of those was good and one of them was bad. It was purely like an abstractly morally negative view of sex.
Yeah, I think my kind of major criticism, not major, more my primary criticism of Bataille is that it feels very much like for him, that women are used as like tools, as symbols, as kind of as the route to God, the route to access, continuity, but they're never the continuity themselves. Like they never get to experience that. They are always the subject, like you said. And like in My Mother, it's like, she's the seducer who leads him to God, but he's still the one that gets to access that transcendence. And at the end of it, she essentially says, "You still don't know me." She's like, you still don't really know what's going on, because there's still something of it where there's the pursuit of continuity hasn't been reached between the two of them, I don't think. And yeah, for me, like there's definitely this idea for him that women are just the vehicle or the vessel for something else.
He is so bad on this one topic. I mean, I remember I was going to write something for the book called like Bataille's theory of reproduction, and I thought there's no point, it's wrong, because like he hums up the whole theory of like the reproduction of life, say continuity and discontinuity. I'm like, well, I'm going to go to the accursed share, where he spends a lot of time on the solar system, the sun, all of human history. Control F, pregnancy. It's mentioned once in relation to cows, and I'm like, fucking hell, George. I mean, his sources and other things like Bataille, like Islam and Tibetan religion are also atrocious. But that is one of the real limits to Bataille is the fact it's almost like the old joke about the Greeks and the Romans. That the Greeks invented love and then the Romans added women into the equation. Bataille invented eroticism, and now we just have to add women back into the equation because it's so missing in his discourse. I mean, you can see how Lacan picked up on that by then declaring that women didn't exist.
I think also, thinking in terms of like the politics of the mother, it can go south very quickly depending on who you're asking. I've been forced to deal with Camille Paglia, of all people, recently, who was before my time, but an art critic, and she likes to talk about the mother in a traditional sense, and it's as empowering in and of itself, and that is very seductive, I think, to have this return again to stability, the stability of the archetype of the mother throughout history. And I think your work for me in general, like going back to big picture, and I think pornography does a wonderful job of forcing us to interact with these themes. I think one of my childhood friends commented on like one of my first art shows, like, I can't believe you just made me stare at someone having sex for like 30 minutes. But there's something about being forced to interrogate that can be very powerful. I'm curious, as we're kind of getting to the hour mark, what's next for you? What areas have you not been at the frontier of yet? Adam and I kind of called you before you got here, like you're an engineer of sorts. You're a libidinal engineer. You're building pathways, bridges, if you will, in a libidinal economy. What are you worried about, maybe? And then what are you working on? Yeah.
I definitely feel the pull to resist exactly what you said with this kind of sterilization of sex and of every facet of our kind of human interactions at the moment, that like the cleaning up of porn, like the sanitizing of porn, because we have this kind of idea that initially, on the Christian right, porn's never, it's always been bad, but it's been bad for these reasons. But actually more and more now we're seeing like this soft kind of anti-porn rhetoric, which is this idea that like, oh, there's, the good porn is like this, like good porn shows, it's authentic, it's realistic, it shows only authentic pleasure, it's very safe, it's softly lit, it's made for women, maybe it's a wellness product, like it's good for you, it's something that is, and there's good porn and there's bad porn. And for me, I really felt like I often get lumped into, because I'm a woman, I was making porn at a particular time. A lot of this discourse was very prevalent. And, there are a lot of people who are my peers who I love and respect their work deeply, who also kind of like maybe adhere to that kind of that presentation of maybe the slightly more like good porn versus bad porn. But for me, I feel like more and more pulled to the idea of porn as like exploratory, or porn as a way of thinking about other things. Like what does porn and sex tell us about other things in society? How can I kind of use my relationship to sex, which honestly in the last 10 years has become incredible, like way more complicated than it ever was at the beginning. And my relationship to porn making, my relationship to sexual performance, my relationship to the ethics of it, the ways in which I had very simple ideas of like, oh yeah, this is fine for this reason. And, out 10 years down the line, it's not necessarily as simple as that. So I want to kind of hold it in its complexity and its mess. And I want to be drawn towards the ways in which it can ask questions rather than give answers. And it can be a tool of exploration and not something that limits you. And I think for a lot of people, their relationship to pornography maybe does in some capacity sometimes feel limiting, because I think it's harder and harder to have an exploratory relationship to sexuality in a culture that, really treats it as disposable, dangerous, and, essentially inherently immoral. So for me, I'm like, I'd like to go more towards the mess and less towards the sanitary. And I'm actually in the process where we're shooting a couple of things over the next month. And I'm kind of really, over the last year, I've been experiencing like a lot of burnout. I've been making films for a long time, and I felt like I've been outputting, but I haven't really been doing a lot of inputting. And I have a complicated relationship to making myself an image, making myself making myself a product, making my image something that can be sold, that is kind of out there. And then trying to make a film about that, basically the idea of sexual performance and the flattening of that. So yeah.
Fantastic. First of all, have I got a book for you?
Please.
I wrote a book called The New Flesh, which is basically about how we started relating to our bodies. Now, I'll send over an EPUB, but we'll put this part. But again, Vex, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find your material? Obviously, we'll put it all down, the link down below.
Yeah, so I everywhere on the internet as like, my name's Vex Ashley, and my handle is like Vex Tape, like sex tape, and my project is called Four Chambers. Our website is fourchamberedheart.com, and we're basically everywhere on the internet as like Four chambers.
I'm wearing the shirt.
Oh,
Yeah.
we like to see. Thank you.
There is merch available. Pornography is a method, folks.
Mm.
What we have to learn today, it is not just content. You know, as Mark Fisher said, some people want Nietzsche in the same way they want a cheeseburger. But that indigestibility, that is Nietzsche. That is pornography. Nietzsche is porn. Wait, there was that AI image of Nietzsche's dick going around a few years back. But let's leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us, Noah. Cheers for joining us again. As per, always a pleasure. And everyone, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.